Welcome to That's Lit, the Lightbox podcast. We're a venture capital firm based in Mumbai, investing in consumer businesses in India. On this podcast, we're going to be talking about all things consumption, culture, and technology. Our idea is simple. We love to learn. Come learn with us. Together, we'll dig into new ideas, new ways of thinking, and new approaches to solving problems from industry experts across various fields. We hope you enjoy it. Okay, welcome to another episode of That's Lit. Our guest today is Vindi Banga, who's a partner at CB&R. However, most of you probably know Vindi as the head of Unilever, first at Hindustan Unilever, for a very, very long time. He's someone obviously who has seen a lot of changes in India and led a lot of the changes that we've seen in the FMCG market, as well as in the overall talent market in this country. And so we're going to dive in and talk to him about his journey at HUL, what he's seen, and also a little bit of his journey as a private equity investor on the other side of the table, and what he thinks now as a result of where he is.
Hello and welcome to That's Lit, the Lightbox podcast where we talk about the things that make you go,
Welcome, Vindi, to our broadcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So I'm going to start with a little bit of a personal question. I actually don't know the answer to this, although and something I've never thought of asking you before. But I heard that there's a hostel in IIT Delhi called Vindhyachal, and that's where your colloquial name comes from, rather than just a shortened version of your current name, your real name. I mean, is that true?
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you or whoever thought of that, but it is not true. No. Actually, my name Vindi was simply set because it's quite difficult to say my full name Manvinda, and the only person who really used to use my full name was my grandmother. Everybody else calls me Vindi.
So it has nothing to do with IIT Delhi.
No, unfortunately not.
Okay. I'm going to put a comment on the the internet site that said this because I thought it was really funny. You didn't go. Did you stay in this hostel?
No, I was in the Nilgiri hostel.
Ah, okay. So, yeah, I noticed, and I didn't know this either, that you were a gold medalist at IIT Delhi in mechanical engineering. But
Yep, that's right.
you decided to get an MBA and not follow through on that. That it sounded really. It is unusual to even think about. Like you didn't even try to get a job in what you studied. Is there a reason why you moved?
Well, look, I thoroughly enjoyed my time at IIT Delhi. I think engineering is a great educational background. It's very numerate and quantitative, so you become very comfortable with numbers, which I think is a great asset in life and whatever you do after that. I think it also helps you become a better problem solver because that's what engineering is all about. So I thoroughly actually enjoyed the time at the IIT. But when I was close to graduating and I looked at the kind of jobs that were open, I felt that they tended to be extremely narrow and did not give much of an opportunity to engage with the business as a whole. One tended to be either in manufacturing or logistics or something. And that's when I thought I should actually take up an MBA and gain a perspective of the business as a whole before I started working. And I was fortunate enough to get admission into one of the IIMs, IIM Ahmedabad, and therefore I went off there.
And your change in track and your graduation from there, is that what kind of led you into getting into the FMCG market and getting into this space?
Yes, I would say so. So at the IIM, I studied all the subjects as one might imagine, and was particularly fascinated by marketing. I thought it was a very, very interesting area and hugely challenging. And therefore, I decided to look for a career with that focus. And at the time, I mean, Hindustan Lever was the preeminent marketing company in India, and probably still is. And therefore, I applied for that, and I was hugely fortunate to be selected as a management trainee. That's how you got in then.
So I think we want to spend a little bit of, not a little, a lot of our time on especially your journey as a CEO at Hindustan Unilever. And a lot of it is really to do with the fact that how you've described the time that you became CEO, and what the challenges that you faced at that time are very, very similar in some ways to how companies are having to deal with times today, albeit for different reasons. And I'll explain why we felt like that. We heard you say, in an earlier podcast, that when you became CEO, the company hadn't been growing for a few years, and along with that, liberalization was playing out, and competition was coming into the country, starting with P&G. And you kind of realized that as a team, until that point, you were really relying on maybe a combination of capacity and a great distribution network. And now that wasn't going to be enough. And you had to become more innovative as a company. Where today, as we said, especially as investors in consumer brands, we see this happening in a very large way, not because of liberalization, but because of the combination of the internet and a lot of private equity venture capital money going into this market, allowing for both an opportunity to build brands quickly and also not rely on or on a distribution network that is very difficult to enter.
Hmm.
So I think suddenly you've got Indian consumers that are getting access to a plethora of brands, not necessarily international brands as much, though quite many more than they were before, but domestic brands that are getting a tremendous amount of funding and have access to this massive internet penetration that we have in our country.
Yeah.
Where do you see a lot of this ending up? You obviously when you use the word, we have to be more innovative.
Yeah.
The HUL back then. If you had to kind of redefine what that would mean in today's context, could you tell us what you did then, and if you were
Sure.
there today, what you would do today in order to kind of differentiate and grow your brands?
Sure. So, look, I think you've captured much of the context. At the time, I'm now in year 2000, Hindustan Lever had not grown its top line for a couple of years, but actually had continued to grow its bottom line. And effectively, that was coming by reducing the amount of spend behind its brands. And that, as we all know in the consumer business, you can do that for quite a long time until your top line begins to drop. Um, but it's bad for the brands. The external context was what you described. There was a lot of competition. India had liberalized, and therefore the global players were all looking at India's big market opportunities. So, of course, P&G was already there, but so were the others, L'Oreal, etc. But there was also extraordinarily good quality local competition that the company would have to deal with. So, both global and local. But there was another aspect which was not fully understood. The FMCG market was actually declining by 3 or 4%, in a market where the GDP was growing strongly, in an economy where the GDP was growing strongly. And this was quite a paradox. And this was actually what the company was finding very hard to deal with to grow. The reason for this is that consumers were suddenly given a plethora of new expenditure opportunities they never had earlier. For example, mobile phones were growing at that stage, and therefore you could spend money on actually a mobile phone or gadgets, electronic gadgets, televisions, etc. So people were spending a bit less on their FMCG products, maybe choosing a slightly more affordable brand. You couldn't stop using them because, of course, they are essential products for your day to day life. But people were trading down a little bit, and the FMCG market, therefore, was not growing. So, this was the context in which we had to think through what is the next phase of the company. Um, so we made a couple of choices. I think the first decision we had to take was to choose where we were going to compete and win. And that is basically you've got to decide where your right to play, right to win really exists, as the consultants call it. We were in lots and lots of businesses which were legacies from the FERA time. If you recollect back in the 70s, the government had said that multinationals could operate in India either if their core sector turnover was above 50% of their total sales, or indeed 10%, and 10% of their sales must be exports to earn foreign exchange. Both these conditions had to be met. And Hindustan Lever had reacted and gone into a number of businesses which were non traditional in nature. Now, as India was opening up, the context was very different. We had a business in nickel catalyst, for instance, where I think our capacity was quite small. It was about 2,000 tons. But now India was open, and we would have to compete with nickel catalyst companies, global companies with manufacturing capacities several times in magnitude, like 300,000 tons, 500,000 tons, and so on and so forth. So we took a decision that we would have to progressively exit these businesses which we had entered for protectionist reasons and government regulation reasons in that period, and instead focus all our energies on our core consumer business. This was quite a difficult decision because, if memory serves me right, I think these businesses were quite significant. They accounted for about a third of the company and perhaps only 10 or 15% of its profit. So they were a real drain on the company. And we spent a lot of time actually thinking through the exit of each of these businesses. These were difficult choices. We had to make sure that we exited them in a very responsible manner, creating value for the shareholders on the one hand, and these were good businesses, and also at the same time taking care of all the employees who had built these businesses through very challenging times. So we went through a number of options and exited these businesses, finding different solutions for each case. In some cases, it was an outright sale. In some cases, we went through a joint venture route. And a number of international players actually bought these businesses as a way to secure a foothold in India. This particular strategy, I think, released a lot of resources. We released a lot of cash. And that cash we used partly to rejuvenate the current business, which I'm going to come back to, and partly to reward our shareholders as well, who had been patient for quite a while. So we did both. So I guess the first decision we had to take was to choose where to win. And we chose to play and focus on our core consumer business and exit all the non-consumer businesses. I think the second thing was then to figure out how to reignite growth for our core consumer businesses and our brands. And that meant really trying to understand where the innovation should come. That is all about listening to the customer and the consumer. We started a drive in the company to get everybody connected with the customer and the consumer. Unsurprisingly, at times like this, when your top line is not growing and you're trying to grow your bottom line to keep your EPS growing, our quality in many of our products had been compromised. We started a system where every 4 or 5 months, every single manager in the company would, on a couple of days, actually go out and visit either consumer homes or shops. And this was not dedicated only to sales and marketing people. This was every single manager in the company. And they had to come back and actually distill what they heard. And one of the big results of this activity was a great focus on product quality, because when they went out, they heard that our product quality was not what it used to be. And therefore, they came back and there was a big drive to improve our products. And that, by the way, is also, it's like renovation. In the FMCG business, what you have to do is a combination of renovation and innovation. Renovation is all about making small improvements that keep your products up to date, current, working really well, well presented. And then there is innovation from time to time. In terms of innovation as well, there was a big focus on the marketing and R&D teams to actually improve products and come out with new ideas that would create attractive businesses. I remember one of the most interesting innovation projects was to produce a laundry detergent that used much less water. This was a huge challenge, as you might imagine, in parts of the country where people had to stand in queues in the south of India to get water. So it was all about finding relevant needs and actually innovating in those spaces to provide the right products for the right time. Now, I mentioned right in the beginning that because the company had not grown in top line, and yet the bottom line had grown, some of the brand investment had been cut down. And it was clear that we needed to reinvest in our brands and improve that spend level. And that could only come by reducing the cost structure of the company. So we launched a very large program to reduce the indirect cost of the business. And that's never easy. But from time to time, I think companies need to do that because over time they just attract cost. It's almost just a feature of business. So we really looked at.
Vindi means mostly people. Is that what is it?
It was both. It was people. We looked very carefully to see how we could make more efficient structures and more agile structures, less levels, and also at reducing other costs, non-people costs. One of the things that you realize in business is that actually people attract a lot of non-people cost. So when you simplify the structure and make it more lean and agile with few people doing bigger jobs, actually the overall cost comes down, not just the people cost, but also the non-people cost. So we did that, and we actually put back the money into our brands. And we can talk more about brand innovation if you like. Is that something you'd like to hear about?
I think we will. I'll come back to that. I'll come back to the brand. It would be really interesting to, just getting back to your point on exits that you had to do. You mentioned you were looking for where you had the right to win, the ability to win, and kind of keeping those companies. How did you decide, like, okay, this is one I want to keep? Is it that they were you were a clear number one in that space? Your ability the competition to take a chunk out of your business was limited. or your margins were very high. What were the metrics that you were looking for the winners?
I think the most important metric was our current position in the market, but also our ability to compete in that market long term. Because it was partly, of course, your current position, but then you had to work out, well, what's going to change in the market in the next 5 years? Now, had a very strong position in most of our core consumer businesses, and we were clear, therefore, that we could compete very strongly in all our key consumer businesses like tea, personal wash, soap, detergents, skincare. We knew that we'd be very, very strong in these markets because we had good brands, good positions, and a very good understanding of these businesses. On the other hand, in businesses, as I was saying, nickel catalyst, a fertilizer, these are businesses where we felt long term we would not be able to compete in these businesses because we would have these are very different from our core consumer businesses, and we would have to spread our investments in those areas, which would not be feasible. So it came from the metrics we used were very much our current presence in those categories, but also our opportunity to compete into the future and how much capital they would draw um, uh, to be able to compete.
And did you have in mind did you start the exercise with a number of businesses that you would keep, or did you just say, okay, whichever ones are being able to are in a position today of leadership, and we believe we will be able to compete long term in, we're going to keep those businesses irrespective of how many they will be versus how many we have today?
We looked very carefully at our non-core businesses because when I say core non-FMCG, we looked very carefully at those because we said, look, these are businesses that are not central to the company, nor are they central to Unilever outside India. And therefore, these are areas that we would have to compete very much on our own. So we looked at all the non FMCG businesses extremely carefully.
Nothing core at FMCG was looked at as far as saying, let's remove this business.
We looked at some, and I think one of the businesses that was exited was Vanaspati. And Vanaspati was exited because of the whole trans fat issue. There was a concern around health of those products, and as a category, we decided to exit those businesses. Now, we could have, of course, exited the Vanaspati business and kept the brand name and tried to re-enter other categories of cooking mediums, but we actually took the decision that we would capture more value by selling the business as a whole and the brand as a whole. So we exited those categories.
Got it. Got it. I wanna spend a little bit of time on your point on innovation, and I think and specifically to do with consumer insights. You sent such a large portion of your team out in the market talking to consumers, and some of the consumer feedback was on what you called renovation. Um, when someone says your product quality, if you're making a soap or a washing detergent, and someone says your product quality is not what it used to be, what does that mean? It's not. I mean, are you because you're manufacturing this stuff and the facilities are the same? Has it been? Is it gotten worse, or they were just expecting it to get better and it didn't?
No, it's usually a relative comment, and mostly consumers will tell you, what your quality is with respect to the other choices they have. So, for example, on a soap, they might tell you that, look, your soap doesn't lather as quickly, or the lather is not a full lather, or I don't like the perfume. I can smell the chemicals. So we would get feedback like this.
Is that because the competition had come and they
Yes,
were doing it, and you were just doing the same thing you were doing before, but now it wasn't good
exactly.
enough? Is that
Exactly. Somebody had moved the bar, and you had not moved. You were actually behind the competition. And then you have to diagnose. Well, look, what is the reason for this? Is it the product formulation? Have people weakened the formulation to actually cut cost and therefore increase the margin? Or is it to do with the process of manufacturing? Are there issues in the manufacturing process that, controls or whatever that need to be improved? So you had to go through a whole process of diagnosis and then decide what it was that you were going to do. And we did that.
Got it. Okay, I'm going to move topics a little bit. I'm going to move to marketing, but before I do, I wanted to ask you another question that I felt you had to handle in a way that I think a lot of entrepreneurs today have to handle as well, and that is shareholders and managing shareholders. You had a primary shareholder, which was a foreign company. And at the same time, you had the responsibility to local shareholders through the public markets. Now, this is a slightly different, but entrepreneurs today that have raised money in the private markets have an interesting challenge that could be similar to what you had to face, which is they're managing a board which is largely composed of pure play financial investors. Who are not maybe as connected to the company, but they're there by virtue of giving money. But at the same time, they got to run their business, which might not link directly to the needs of those shareholders on their board. I was just wondering, and maybe it's not a direct correlation to what you had to go through, but I'm assuming that managing expectations of the parent entity and managing expectations of shareholders was different at some levels. And what would your advice? First of all, was it? And second, just based on your experience, what would your advice be to founders today?
Look, I think it's a really good point. It was a very unique company, even within Unilever, because it had, as I said, the principal shareholder, which was Unilever. And at the time, Unilever only had 50% of the company, unlike today, where I think it owns probably 70% of the company. So they had 50%, but of course, they had the golden share. I mean, they could appoint the chairman and the CEO, like I was an appointee of Unilever. Then there was the rest of the shareholding, 50%, was split almost equally between 100,000, 120,000 lay shareholders, people who had a few thousand shares each or some 100 shares each. And the 25% of the shareholding base was the Fidelities of the world and the big global investors. So what was really important here was to engage with all the shareholders and explain what we were trying to do. I mean, that was hugely important. You couldn't just talk to either the principal shareholder, Unilever, and then just do whatever else you wished. When we decided what we were going to do, the strategy that I've been discussing earlier, we engaged with all our shareholders. Of course, we engaged with Unilever, but we also engaged with all our other shareholders to explain what it is that we were trying to do and to explain the time that it would take for us to come through this journey of reinventing the company for the new India. So I think communication to shareholders is extremely important, and that's a piece of advice for your founders. It's really important to engage with your shareholders. I know it takes time, and they'd rather be spending time, running the company, but it is hugely important. Founders have one other opportunity, by the way, which is really important, which is to choose their shareholders. And I think that's a really important aspect, because when founders are setting up their company, they need cash, they need investment. And there are lots of people out there who can give them investment. But just as investors are choosing founders, founders should also choose investors and make sure, to the extent that is possible, that they pick like-minded investors who share their vision, who share their ambition, and will probably be supportive. Not that they shouldn't be challenging, but they would be supportive of the approach that the founder takes.
I think this is uh, such an important point that it gets lost so much because you especially young or young entrepreneurs, young not being age wise, but just new being new at doing this. there's a level of fear that if I don't just take whoever's ready to give me money, I am going to lose out, not wondering what's going to happen once you take the money. Dekhi jayega kind of an attitude
Yeah.
to this entire thing. Uh, you obviously had no choice in choosing your core investor. How much time did you invest in building a relationship that gave you the opportunity to do what you thought was the right thing to do versus having them trust you to make that decision versus having to go back constantly, especially at a time where you were making such drastic changes to the company?
Well, you have to spend quite a bit of time, and I think it's hard to put a number on it. But you have to spend as much as necessary. It's really important. It's a kind of gating condition for leaders. They have to carry their shareholders with them through a transformation journey. I mean, that's what we were trying to do here. We were trying to transform Hindustan Lever to a company that would be fit for the new India and compete and grow in the new India. It had done extraordinarily well prior to that through all kinds of challenges and all kinds of circumstances. And the question was now to take it to the next phase. And those choices needed to be explained. And therefore, we just took whatever time that was necessary. Now, you can never get it completely right. And there will always be, investors that will criticize your actions and demand more speed and demand more, change and all of those things. So I think what you can do is to try your best to actually communicate as far as possible and then move as quickly as possible and keep moving. One other thing I should explain is that in governance terms, for something of this nature, because 50% of the majority of the company was owned by Unilever, we had to have a number of non-independent, Unilever directors, independent directors.
Right.
And they were extremely choosing those directors and getting their expertise to help us to think through this whole thing was also very, very valuable.
Did the board not remain the same as it was? Did the board change during your?
You had to have a majority of independent directors.
Right. I was just asking, but as you came in to start leading the company, did the structure of the board change at that time, or you kind of?
No, it was pretty much the Cadbury committee had just about come out, and therefore this structure was just put into place just before I came in.
I see. Got it. So I'm going to move to you started talking a little bit about reinvesting in the brand and where the money came from, of course, but also how the money was going to be spent. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on brand building. This is the ultimate 101 class, getting brand advice from the former CEO of HUL. But before I kind of get into that, it's something that we've been struggling with a lot in our fund as well, and thinking about it as companies kind of come to us. HUL doesn't put their name, their umbrella brand name on their products in a noticeable fashion, or doesn't use the trust perhaps of the Hindustan Unilever name to promote their products, similar to, like, let's say a P&G, etc. There are companies that were formed later, and more recently, like let's say a Patanjali, for example, that use their name as the reason to buy their product.
Yes.
Could you talk to us a little bit about why that, what the difference is, and why HUL decided to go in a certain direction? I'm sure from the very beginning, I assume, and what the history of that thought is, and why it's kind of lingered till today.
Well, I think the difference in approach is about where you want to build your quote unquote expertise. If you have an umbrella company brand name, then that brand name is the source of expertise. And you could do it across a certain number of categories which are contiguous in nature, very similar in nature. But it's then hard to stretch that brand name across categories that are different in nature. Um, we followed the alternative approach, which is we said we want to be the best brand expert in every category that we operate in. And to do that, we would need to focus on individual brands. So if you're in the soap business, it's not Hindustan Lever that is going to be having a soap, a single soap. We might want to have a portfolio of brands in the soap business. And therefore, we had Lifebuoy, we had Lux, we had Liril, we have a whole number of brands, right? If you had only the Hindustan Lever brand, you could only have one brand. So your ability to dominate a category with a portfolio of brands and really build core expertise in that category is much better when you follow individual brands.
And so if I take that and then say, okay, I've got a brand in this category. How do you decide how far you can expand that brand? Like, let's say you have a close up,
Yeah.
in it's done toothpaste. Now you also you've moved into mouthwash, but you
Yeah.
haven't gone any further. Like, it's not like close up can, and I don't know, maybe get into skincare, for example. How do you decide how far you can go?
Well, you've got to start with what does the brand really stand for? And in the case of Close Up, the brand stands for mouth freshness, fresher breath.
Right.
That's what it does. So, if that's what the brand stands for, then you can't go into skincare by definition because that's not about mouth freshness, right? But you can stay in any areas which are linked with mouth freshness. And for example, of course, mouthwash is a classic example, but there could be others. There could be toothbrushes,
Right.
or other areas. So you've got to decide what the brand stands for, and then really expand into territory where that promise is relevant.
As you're looking at these brands and you're building them out, and you're using this, we'll use the word promise that you've that you just mentioned right now. Does it make sense to be able to have a broader promise that allows for that brand that you already recognize? And I'll just use close up because we brought it up, but uh, because you've already marketed it to be a certain way,
Yeah.
and so now it's easier to kind of add to that because your promise is that much larger or more broad based in order to expand rather than trying to build up another brand altogether.
Well, the thing is, you got to be careful with that because um, there's no free lunch. If you broad base your promise to enter other categories, effectively you are reducing its, let's say, laser expertise in its core category. And let's take the same example as Close Up. It's You could either say, look, this is a mouth freshness brand, or you say, well, hang on a minute, uh, let's treat this as a freshness brand.
Right.
And where else do you need personal freshness? Could it go into personal freshness? Could you have uh, a spray, a body spray? Could you have a deodorant? Now, of course, you could, but I think the moment you did that, you will start weakening its ability to be the expert in mouth freshness.
Right.
So I think that's the trade off. And I think you've got to be very careful with brands. Building brands is one of the most, I think, wonderful things to be able to do, to choose the territory that you wish to dominate and then dominate that single mindedly. You know what? One thing that is really interesting is the definition of a brand. If you look up the dictionary, you will see that the definition started from the imprint that was used to print on cattle the name of the owner. That's where the name brand came from. So think about it that way, that you actually want to imprint on a consumer's mind what a brand stands for. And remember that, the consumers got so much choice. They're not actually sitting there thinking about all this. They're taking purchasing decisions in nanoseconds as they walk past a shop, or in fact in front of their computer. So, you've got to be really focused, very clear, and your brand has to have a single point and it has to jump out.
Yeah, it's a very interesting um, balance, over and over again, we're seeing companies, very young companies, um, try and do the latter, which is, I mean, and at least that's what we're seeing in the market, and I think it's also a learning, I think, curve that they'll go through, where they're starting out down one product line, and then they're expanding into many other product lines without having secured a promise effectively enough in even one of them, unfortunately, and therefore not being able to really gain traction in anything because now their product doesn't
I
really stand for
agree.
one thing.
I think I agree with you. And every time I've been advising founders, I have actually asked them to think hard about establishing their expertise in one area as opposed to covering the ground, and gaining scale. And there is this tension because there is a feeling that actually you are rewarded for scale and growth, but I think it has to be the right scale and the right growth. If
Right.
you merely collect apples and oranges and pears, that's going to be less valuable than the best apples.
Absolutely. Oh, I'm going to use that. I might erase that from this podcast and use it as my own. Thank you. What actually? So let me ask you this. One other part of this product, and in choosing both the correct promise and the what links to the product is India itself. What kind of product and what promise is attached to it has a lot to do with the the culture in which you're trying to sell the product, right? And obviously you had the opportunity. Of course, you were kind of thinking of your own products, but there was a slew of products that the umbrella entity already sold globally, and a lot of them, of course, you brought in Hindustan Lever or Hindustan Unilever, and then tweaked and thought of how to kind of bring it in and then marketed it. Were there anything that did really well globally, but and you thought could do very well in India because it did globally, but it didn't really work out, and so you just, although it was part of the package of what was sold in Unilever, really wasn't that big a deal in Hindustan Lever or Hindustan Unilever?
Well, I think there were most things, most strong brands globally did have appeal in many geographies, but often the market conditions weren't ready. For example, um, uh, machine wash detergents were not relevant in India till washing machines were ubiquitous or everywhere. So a number of brands actually were not that relevant in India because the either the housing conditions or homes or surfaces or consumer needs were not ready. But let me give you a very good example of the reverse. Take a brand like Lifebuoy. Now, it's really interesting that diarrhea is one of the biggest killers in India. And diarrhea basically spreads through poor hand hygiene. That's where it spreads from. And yet, in our country, and it's linked with the way in which people actually perform their personal rituals and either don't cleanse their hands adequately, etc. That's actually the problem. And Lifebuoy
No, I'm sorry.
is
The
a
problem is
brand.
that they don't wash their hands in the right manner.
Yes, they don't use a good soap to wash their hands so that they actually get rid of all the germs,
Got it. Okay.
and they then transmit the germs to their mouth, and that's where they get diarrhea. Now, this was a huge problem in India, probably still is. And Lifebuoy actually occupied this position because Lifebuoy, as you know, was formulated to kill germs. But it's when we actually thought about it beyond just killing germs, and we linked it with this larger idea that, look, this brand was your personal defense against ill health. That particular connection, when we made that connection, it became a huge success. And that particular campaign really rejuvenated a Lifebuoy that was declining. Interestingly, this sort of thing is not just about advertising, but to convey this, our teams actually created Lifebuoy hand wash demonstrations in schools. They ran educational campaigns in rural India. They associated themselves with associations of doctors to really take the high ground that Lifebuoy was waging a war against ill health. And so that's the sort of thing you need to do to make brands larger than life and become totally expert in their space.
It's really interesting you use Lifebuoy as an example. I was recently with someone who recently quit HUL to start his own company and his own brand in a different space, nothing that HUL sells. And he was telling me about the difference between Lifebuoy and what HUL, how Lifebuoy was built out versus the stick deodorants,
Yeah.
where the change in user behavior or the mentality of sweat versus smelling good and getting and especially for men to be more attractive towards women, we weren't able to change. And Lifebuoy, because and it just seemed to me, and I've been wanting to ask this and I didn't get a chance to ask him, but it seemed like the way he was saying it, it was more to do with how Lifebuoy was marketed. And I guess what he meant is exactly what you just said right now.
Yeah.
And the ability to explain why it's important in a very easy way versus stick deodorant, which was helping you with sweat, but all the fogs and everyone else was making the idea of perfume and smelling good more important than the idea of controlling your sweat.
Exactly, and that's where I think marketing is so interesting. I mean, another example was the launch of the brand Wheel,
A
where
wheel. So wheel. Okay, yeah.
Wheel was launched to compete against, in the low cost segment, which had been opened up by Nirma. And Nirma was very well established at the time that Wheel was launched. So the question was, how do you get people to actually move from Nirma to Wheel? And eventually, as we did lots and lots of consumer studies, we found that one thing about Nirma was that your hands felt slightly warm and almost a slight sensation of burning when you were washing Nirma. And that came because it had a very high concentration of carbonate in the formulation. It gave it its efficacy,
Right.
but equally, it gave you that feeling on your hands. So we actually formulated a product that would give equivalent results, but without as that much of carbonate in the formulation. And therefore, it didn't give you that feeling on your hands. And we were able to position Wheel as a brand that gave you an excellent wash quality, but did not burn your hands. And consumers could immediately recognize that when they tried Wheel, they could feel the difference on their hands. So it was a great success. So you have to actually find a very relevant point of difference that consumers will experience, not just tell them. They have to be able to experience that point of difference.
And I guess at some level, it needs to be simple enough for them to understand what you're referring to.
Exactly, it has to be. I mean, that's the point. But usually when you spend enough time with consumers, you have a very good understanding of the challenge. And then, of course, there are so many communication experts who would be able to help you in translating that idea into very simple language to make sure it gets through.
I'm sure you're seeing and recognizing. You're seeing, and I was going to say recognizing that you've done this for a long time, but there's this company called Thrasio, and they
Mhm.
basically buy a lot of brands up and then kind of let them go on their own and help them use their own platform to be able to scale. So they buy small brands, and now there are a lot of these companies that are coming up that are the Thrasio of this, or Thrasio of that, and basically what they're doing is that they're creating a house of brands, and
Yeah.
it's um, it's being coined as the new way to build a business, which obviously it's not, because it's exactly in a lot of ways what companies like Unilever did almost a century ago.
Yeah.
Um, when you look at businesses like this, uh, what do you think the the winners are going to look like? They're not using their brand name. So let's say the company's name was Thrasio. It's just like Unilever; they wouldn't be using, but they're buying out companies. Now they're buying out; they're not starting and developing their own companies. They're buying out companies that have founders, and
Mm.
then giving them a larger platform and a lot more money, but owning the company. Um,
Well, I think the point is this, that these companies will only be as good or as bad as two things. The first is the quality of the brands underneath them or in the house. So if they collect brands that are unique, that have a point of difference, that are relevant to today's consumer, and those brands continue to be marketed with that differentiation, well, that makes sense. The second thing is that when you have more than one brand, so you have many brands, then there should be some shared value to that platform. It could be that they go to market together, they have the same channel. It could be that they share raw materials and therefore have purchasing synergies. It could be that they have other platform advantages. But you've got to have some reason for all of them to be together. It can't just be a collection of brands, because otherwise, it will not give you any additive value to them being on their own.
is there
Do you see what I
others?
mean?
No, absolutely. And are there certain things that they shouldn't be connected with? Like, should they have their? I mean, is marketing something that is very individualistic in brands, rather than having one marketing department and them thinking for each brand?
Well, the thing is that, if they span different categories, let's say that you have a skincare brand and a tea brand.
Right.
Now, those two don't share much consumer knowledge because they are two completely separate categories. But on the other hand, a skincare brand, a deodorant brand, a personal wash brand, those share a knowledge of the consumer who's actually looking after his or her personal, appearance and personal health. So I think that you've got to figure out what's the synergy between categories of brands.
Got it. No, that's. I think this is something that we're now, spending time trying to understand, and obviously, a lot of money has, in India especially, has gone into very, very young companies that are using that capital, the equity capital, to really buy out, and then adding debt to it, and then buying out majority portions in these companies. And so, I think this insight is actually really, really interesting because, right, I think from what we're seeing, a lot of them are using P&Ls to determine what to buy, what not to buy. But I think the idea of that going way beyond that and saying, this is how we can use our platform to help the most number of brands if they are within this box, and then making sure that you can give that support. I think I'm not sure how many are doing it like that, quite honestly. I wanted to touch on team. For an incredible amount of time in modern Indian history, from a corporate standpoint, uh, what used to be Hindustan Lever or Hindustan Unilever, um, has been known to cultivate talent better than anyone else. And so, joining the management trainee program, like you had done so many years ago, current today, the relevance of a management trainee at Hindustan Unilever is equivalent to what it was for you and much before you as well. Um, as people start new businesses, what does it take to build a culture where people want to join you and people that join you want to be nurtured through longer periods of time with you? What needs to happen within the organization? And I know for you, you went through it. Then you had to recultivate it when you became CEO to some extent, because you were letting go of businesses. You were changing the structure of your indirect costs as well, and so much had to happen after you became CEO in a culture that you had grown up in your entire adult life. So could you talk to us a little about that?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really important to believe that people make all the difference. You hear this a lot, but you have to believe this passionately. And I saw this in practice in perhaps my sales training days itself when I joined the company, and I was working in Madhya Pradesh, and I could see the difference in different towns in terms of brand shares and so on. The products were the same, the consumer was roughly the same, the competition was roughly the same, but our brand shares would vary, and it would very often be down to the local distributor, how good he was or she was, and how good our local sales force was in that particular town. People make a difference at every level. They make a difference, not just at the top of the company, they make a difference in every possible activity. So that is, I think, something that's a fundamental belief that I have always carried. Now, to your point, what attracts people into organizations? I think people today join organizations for their values. Secondly, they join them to learn, and they stay in them as long as they feel they are evolving themselves positively, they're getting something from that organization. And thirdly, they want personal growth. So I think those three things are really important: values, learning, and personal growth. That is, in my book, at least, very, very important to attracting and retaining the right talent.
And when you have to inculcate this, um, what is what differentiates a good company versus a great company in kind of inculcating? Is it the top-down approach and the time that you spend with your managers and teaching them how much time they should be spending with their managers, the assistant managers, and so on and so forth? Is it your communication to three rungs under you? Is it what's the driving force from an operational standpoint to make sure that these three levers are constantly, because you can start it off in a small organization and manage it in a very personal way, but when you have to grow it out, what is the one thing that people should just remember?
I think it's being very clear as to what are the values that you actually want that company to stand for, and then living those values. So, as a founder, you've got to be very clear on that. What are the values of this business? What do you really, really passionately believe in? If you believe, for example, that you will always deliver the best product for the consumer, then do you live those values? Do you actually make every choice, every decision by thinking like that. If you say that this company stands for meritocracy, then do you actually make every decision uh, in that way? So it's choosing the values, it's communicating the values, and it's living the values.
If I can ask one final kind of question right now, and before I let you go, you, as an investor today, on the other side of the table, as you look at consumer brands coming in this environment in India, and it doesn't mean that you're investing in India. I just want to but I wanted to kind of
Yeah.
keep it to an India level. Um, what would you look for today in a brand? I mean, and how would that be perhaps a little different than how you made decisions on which brands to bring into the country, 20 years ago?
Look, I think that to me, the way I'd look at investment opportunities, first of all, if I look at the product or the brand, I'd like to make sure that it is servicing a very relevant need, or it's solving a life problem. And it's doing that, or it's got ambition to do that better than anybody else. So that's the first thing. It's going to be a product or brand that's going to make a difference to somebody's life, a consumer or a customer, depending on what kind of a business is it. That's the first point.
Okay.
But then the second point, and perhaps even the more important point, is the founder, the entrepreneur. Because in the end, people make the difference, back to what we were saying earlier. So to me, the founder and his qualities are, in some ways far more important than the product or brand idea. Because if you're backing the right person, that person will make a business, is more likely to make a business a success.
Is there a skill set for someone who's starting a consumer brand? Is there a skill set outside of, let's say, skill sets you need in general to be an entrepreneur? Is there a skill set that you think you would want to look for specifically in that founder?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say that I think I welcome people who are, first of all, great listeners. So they've got to be out there. Go back to what we were discussing all the time about talking, listening to your consumer, listen to your customer. It's only when you listen actively do you actually understand what problems you're trying to solve and come up with solutions that other people haven't thought of. So you've got to be a great listener to the customer. I think the second thing is I value people who follow the 80-20 rule, which is they get an offering 80% right and start doing something, get to market, learn through doing, adapt. The third corollary to that is people who know when to change. This is building a business is not a straight line, and you're going to have to chop and change direction. You'll make mistakes, or you'll learn from others' mistakes, and knowing when to change the path you're on is really important. Telling the story, being able to tell it persuasively. We talked about discussing with investors earlier. Telling the story simply to investors, to consumers, to employees, to attract talent. I think that's a really important quality. But perhaps the most important quality is determination, resilience, because this is hard. This business of creating businesses is hard. And therefore, you need someone who you feel can have the resilience to take all the knocks and still survive and thrive.
Vindi, thank you so much for spending this time with us. It was an honor, honestly. Thank you so much. This is really,
No,
really.
pleasure to be with you, Sid.